This one is a really short horror story. We were playing an online game and we had one player whose character was named The King, and he lasted all of 10 minutes. In the weeks before the session 0, he kept joking about his hilarious character concept and would not stop laughing about it. The day of session 1 comes. We all meet in the tavern and the exchange goes like this. Greetings, subjects. I'm the king. We keep introducing ourselves and the king's player gets annoyed and says, Didn't you hear me? Show some respect to your liege. You're not our king. You're not even the king of this land. The guy on this coin is. In fact, you're not even the same species as the king. The king's player then blew up at us, called us metagamers, saying our characters should think his character's the king because his name made it sound like he was. He then left the call and we never heard from him again. So, yeah. You know, I'm thinking that they didn't really miss out on much. This was from a few years ago. My real-life group was on hiatus, and I'd been looking for a new group for a while to play in a setting I'd come up with. I ended up advertising on r/LFG for some players. I'd cut the responses down, talk to people to get an impression of them, and answer any questions they had, and finally had 5 players in mind for the group. They all seemed decent, like they'd get along and could both explore and add to the lore of the setting. I sent out the invites. 4 of the players I'd messaged reply within an hour. The 5th arrived after about a day and was, let's say, interesting. The player, I'll call her Lois, not a real name, sent a list of requirements before she joined the campaign. Requirement 1. Lois's character had a custom background. The background was actually fairly balanced mechanically, but its starting gear included 2,500 gold pieces in cash, a not-so-small mansion with servants, which she didn't want to pay, and a monthly income of about 500 gold pieces in actual gear. P.S. We were starting at level 2. Requirement 2. Her character also started with a family heirloom sword because of her character backstory. It was basically a reskinned flame-tongue sword that got more powerful as she leveled. Requirement 3. First pick of any treasure the party found. I would also add a few custom treasures for her character specifically. Requirement 4. Lois's character backstory, basically Romeo and Juliet with the names filed off and the ending unresolved, became setting canon, and Lois could modify it as she wanted. Requirement 5. Lois wanted some one-on-one GM time each session to cover her character's story, plot, development, etc., and during the session, not afterwards. Requirement 6. She wanted at least every 3rd session to focus on her character's backstory, minimum 2 hours per session. Requirement 7. Lois wanted the right to hit players if they were sexist or homophobic to her. If I accepted her generous offer, she would be willing to allow her character to join my campaign. I thought this might be a joke of a sort, so I did check, but no, Lois expected me to agree to pretty much all of this. She was willing to negotiate a little on the starting gear, but only a little, as it was entirely appropriate for her character to start with a ton of cash. As to the other points, Lois said I was the unreasonable one for trying to change them. I've known problem players before and wanted no part in what was clearly main character syndrome, so I dropped her from the Discord straight away and sent an invite to one of the people who was on the reserve list. It did not take long for me to start getting some very upset messages from Lois calling me sexist. Apparently DMs kept inviting her to join a group, then dropping her after all the hard work she'd put into her character, and sexism was the only possible reason. I think overall, I was lucky to avoid this one. Oh, also, point 7, the hitting sexist people thing, was something she'd mentioned during the interview/Q&A session she had. She had mentioned having some trouble with a live group. We agreed that if there was any problem, she'd discuss it with me in private, and she never even mentioned wanting to kick other players herself. Thanks for the clarification on that one. Anyway, sexism and homophobia in D&D groups is a very real thing. We've read many stories about it, but guys, this is not it. This is somebody with main character syndrome. Hell, I'd say borderline narcissism. It's to a point of absolute absurdity. Asking for private sessions with a GM in the middle of a game. Hell, asking for private sessions, demanding private sessions in general, well, it's pretty rude. This is the kind of entitlement that you definitely don't want at a D&D table. There's nothing wrong with a character taking the spotlight every now and then. That's perfectly normal in Dungeons & Dragons. But it is a team game where everyone should get an opportunity to play their character and work together to create an awesome story as a group. This is a lot milder than other people's stories here, but I still want to talk about it because I never have before, and it might put that memory to rest. It was a couple years ago, and I had joined a new World of Warcraft guild to run dungeons and raid with them. The guild was very large but well organized, and even though not everyone knew everyone, the people I did know I got along with really well. One day, I saw a post in our guild's forum inviting people to join a weekly tabletop online game. I had done forum roleplays for much of my childhood and wanted to get into tabletop for a while, so I applied, clearly stating that I was a first-time player. The DM accepted the application, and before session 0, we spent about an hour going over the basics and creating my character. Just your very basic human, with the only special thing about her being a person who could infuse objects with magic, but couldn't remember what they're called. Her backstory was very simple, and her reason for being in the town where the group was meant to meet was that she wanted to find someone to teach her more about magical objects as suggested by the DM. Everything was great. I was so happy with my character and very excited, so when the others joined, we explained our characters and everyone was happy with the party. So to start us off, the DM wanted to just roleplay how the group met, and everyone was fine with that. All our characters arrived somewhere in the city. For example, the rogue was walking through a dark alley, the barbarian arrived by ship, etc. My character walked in from the city gate looking for the expert tinkerer that she wanted to visit. It was fine, we were having fun, but while the rest of the group met up at the tavern almost immediately, the DM focused on my character and made her experience misfortune. First, an NPC emptied a bedpan over her while she was walking towards the tinkerer's shop, covering her with literal crap. The other 3 characters at that point had started talking and getting to know each other, and I wanted to join in, but the DM reminded me that my character was so gross and had such a bad smell that no one would let her in anywhere. So I asked the DM if there was like a bathhouse, and there was, so of course my character visits to clean herself up before meeting the tinkerer and joining the others. While taking that bath, the DM made a street urchin steal all of her clothes and what little money she had. Meanwhile, the other characters had decided to stick together for a while to take on some mercenary work and whatnot. Jumping out of the bath, my character now had no clothes, so she grabbed a towel and ran after the urchin, but the urchin was gone, so she just lost all her money and her clothes, including her instruments. So I assumed our first little quest would be finding my character's stuff, and said that I wanted to visit the tavern to initiate that, but the DM said that I should meet the tinkerer first. Maybe he had some clothes. I assumed it was like a hint, so I agreed. So she goes to the shop, half naked mind you, but oh no, the shop is locked and looking in it seems empty and nothing seems to be touched. So my character asked the people outside the shop when the expert tinkerer would be back, and they say he died. So no money, no materials, no clothes, and no master. My plan was to just meet up with the group and ask them to help, but the DM said I needed clothes first or my character would be very embarrassed, so basically she had to beg random NPCs for clothes, and finally she got a mantle. Meanwhile, the rest of the group had received their first mercenary work from the innkeeper, the actual quest that we would start the next session. It was some weird sword that we needed to get back. At that point, my character was completely separate from the group, had never met them, never saw them, nothing. The group had fun, while I was struggling against the DM who threw as many stones in my character's way as he could, including literal stones. The NPCs would tease her, for example, tell her to get out, and so on. There were several smaller things as well, for example, the aforementioned stone she stepped on and ended up bleeding from, taking minor damage. At this point, the rest of the group wanted to meet up as well, so we quickly discussed and agreed that they would go shopping and my character would meet them there and they would pay for new clothes, which sounded like a perfect plan. Except the DM said because my character was new in town, she did not know where the shops were and had to ask people. So she asked for the way and an NPC told her. She followed the instructions and got lost. At that point, it had been 2 hours, and I was just kind of rolling my eyes and said that my character would just follow the street. But then the road got smaller and smaller and ended up being just a dark alley in which a dark figure was standing. At this point, the group was groaning, and one of the players said, "Can we just group up and go on?" The DM then relented. The dark figure turned out to be an NPC who told her where the shops were. But by then, the group had already moved on, because what else were they supposed to do during all the time it took me to get to the shop in the first place? They were currently at the harbor chartering a boat. So the DM pushed me to go to the harbor as well. He said since my character now needed money and clothes, she would have to find a job on the boat as a deck scrubber and whatnot. My character arrived at the ship, and the session ended on a cliffhanger on whether or not she would get the job on the boat. At that point, I had spent a good 2 hours following a completely different storyline, being kept as separate from the group as possible, and that made a strong impression on me. I felt as though the DM was trying to keep me out of the way of everyone else so I wouldn't bother them with my beginner roleplay, but they didn't seem to mind, and besides, I was RPing pretty much the same as the others because while tabletop is new to me, roleplay as a whole was not. I thought maybe he didn't want me to take part at all, but I noticed no aversion in the time before the group met. Maybe I did something wrong? I felt terrible, and before the next planned session I wrote him a forum message telling him that it wasn't for me and I would go raiding with the guild instead. And that was my first and last D&D session. I found out about this subreddit from a buddy who I'm playing a different MMO with because the topic of tabletop came up, and I told him the story in a haha isn't that funny kind of jokey way, but I'm not gonna lie, it did bother me a bit. Though it might fit here. If it doesn't, please tell me. This absolutely 100% fits here, and yeah, based on this reading, the OP obviously did nothing wrong. Why did the DM do this? I have no idea. Honestly, it almost reads like an incel torture fantasy, and this isn't actually the story that the title is referring to. I've got an even worse one coming out in the end. This is just like a coincidence. Is an incel torture fantasy the actual reason? I have no idea, but beyond that, obviously this is not good. We've had so many horrible introduction sessions on this channel recently. Like, I think the past 3 videos have had terrible first-time player experiences. Maybe that's going to be the next tabletop tavern tips. It seems to be something that a lot of people struggle with, or a lot of people have active malice in. We may never know this man's motives, but what we do know is that doing something like this to a player at the beginning of a D&D session can ruin the hobby for them forever. And of course, that's never good. Hey y'all, I just had the most bizarre experience and I needed to get it off my chest, so here's my first, and hopefully last, RPG horror story. I'm looking to join a long-term campaign, so I'm scrolling LFG looking for something interesting. A post catches my eye about a homebrew campaign. It looks great. Clear rules, distinct, detailed info, rundown of other players and their backstories. I apply with the usual info about myself, experience, style, etc. I hear back from the DM relatively quickly, and we seem to agree that I'd be a good fit and begin discussing character concepts. I throw 2 pretty flexible character options out there, and he turns them down for pretty valid reasons. Alright, fair enough. He asks that I think of a motivation for my character that involves them trying to escape a specific city so that they can meet the party. This was not in the original LFG post, but that's an easy enough thing to incorporate. He adds that he heard a really interesting idea from another candidate who turned out to have a bad vibe, so he asked if I'd be interested in playing that same concept. I find it odd that he'd take a specific character idea from another potential player, but I get inspired for characters from the internet all the time, so maybe I was just being harsh. The idea is for an advanced and unique piece of tech who gains sentience and is on the run from evil corporations who want to enslave them. Pretty cool, not the sort of thing I'd usually go for, but I'm open to adapting it a bit. I comment that I don't really feel comfortable playing a recently awakened machine, as I don't want to RP someone learning things like social norms, nor am I super invested in potential themes surrounding a machine gaining sentience and learning independence, emotion, etc. I thought that this was a pretty reasonable boundary and proposed some alterations. Maybe I could be the inventor of the tech who doesn't want to see his creation enslaved. Maybe I could be an evil core employee who wants out of the organization, so steals the piece of tech to sabotage them and is now on the run. He shoots these down, so I propose several other smaller changes. Things as small as changing the tech's race from Autonome to Warforge. He proceeds to shoot down every single one. He literally says at one point that my character couldn't have invented an advanced piece of tech despite their entire background being a scholar/researcher because they were only level 5. At this point, I'm a little frustrated, but tried not to let it show and instead sent a few more original character concepts not related to this awakened tech idea. Some more detailed ideas, but some as generic as wizard with student debt on the run from creditors to anti-war activist trying to escape from law enforcement. And of course, he shoots them all down, saying, I have no idea how to tie any of this stuff into my narrative. He then asks, what sort of flavor are you thinking for the piece of tech you'll be made from? I'm baffled, as at this point I thought I'd made it pretty clear I didn't want to play the awakened tech character. I send back, as I mentioned, I'm not sure how comfortable I am playing with an awakened drone or robot. It's a cool idea, but it's not the sort of theme I'm super interested in or comfortable exploring, but I'm sure there are multiple ways we could adapt this character concept to be about another race/idea without changing them too much for you narratively. I was then blocked. Anyway, clearly when he said in the post, I like to collaborate with players and build together a unique character that fits with the world and setting. What he meant was, I'm going to insist you play this highly specific character I feel like writing into the story, and if you express any concerns, I will ignore them. TLDR, DM shoots down all my character ideas and insists on me playing his concept, which I'm not comfortable with. He shoots down all my suggestions or requests for modifications, and then he blocks me. Believe me guys, I totally understand what it's like as a DM to start building up the party with the players. It's really, really exciting. And sometimes there are moments where you can get your own character ideas in your head. But at the same time, you gotta temper that excitement and realize that these are the players' characters and you cannot control what they do to this degree. This DM is obviously missing the mark. He's got a dream player here, offering tons of different variations on a concept the DM wants, and then offering tons of fun concepts of their own in a very general sense, so the DM can build them into the setting, and the DM is just complaining about all of them because I guess he doesn't understand what makes a good D&D party, what makes a good character, or what makes a good DM. Hello, this is a tale of an incel player who completely train-wrecked this campaign for both myself and the DM. Even though he seemed nice enough at first, don't they all? This happened a bit over a year ago, and I can't believe I even played with this guy ever after this. Spoiler alert, I did. So I was excited to join a Discord-based Elder Scrolls-themed mini-campaign, and I created a Twilight Cleric with Lorcan as my deity, plus some levels into Bard because why not? There were supposed to be 5 players and the DM. We did have a session 0 where we discussed rules, expectations, and character creation, but over the next 5-ish sessions, more and more of the players failed to show up without notice, were not engaged even when playing, and were generally disruptive until the DM got tired and, after giving them ample enough warning, which they all ignored, booted those players. This is a story unto itself, but I won't focus too much on that because it was mid-pandemic and who knows, they probably had stuff going on. Since we were well into the story at this point, the DM gave myself and the other one remaining player, who shall henceforth be known as Incel, a choice. The DM could either ask other people in the server to join, it was a big D&D community server with various campaigns, one-shots, and RP channels going on, or we could keep going just the 2 of us and she would modify combat to fit a 2-person party instead. We had gotten along well enough, so we decided to just stick it out with the 2-person party, as that way we could each protagonize more and we were having a good time so far. Oh, how naive I was. So, as for Incel's character, it was an elven, I think, but who even remembers at this point? It was an edgy guy, and he was like 2,000 plus years old. Warlock named Arden. Yep, that Arden from Final Fantasy 15. Even had the same exact backstory to boot. For those not too familiar with FF15, Arden is the game's big bad, and a bit of an edgelord, though he can be a compelling character at times. I didn't read this player's backstory, but it was basically the same as the one detailed in Arden's. Spoiler alert, gifted firstborn, lovely fiancé, betrayed by a jealous brother, had his soul sucked out and was imprisoned for 2,000 years before he somehow escaped into Morrowind. I didn't get it when he excitedly told us this during session 0, but hey, whatever makes people happy. Anyway, as I mentioned before, we had no problem playing just the 2 of us, and I was actually quite enjoying a campaign where there were only 2 players, plus our pet Fluffy and Snowball the goat, whom I would have 100% killed for. And though it was a bit taxing at times, the story moved along quickly and the combat was challenging. So, all in all, good times to be had. However, because I'm posting this here, you know that crap will hit the fan soon, and boy, it did. Around session 9-ish, myself and the DM noticed Incel was downcast and wasn't engaging much within the game, which, in a 2-person campaign, meant I had to carry the story completely. We ended up ending the session early and rescheduled for another day that same week, so we could all be engaged with the game. That day comes around, and within minutes of saying hi to each other, we all notice none of us are up for playing that day. Instead, we have a day of bonding and talking to each other about our problems and why we are feeling stressed, sad, frustrated, etc. that day. Now, at this point, I considered both of these people my friends, so we all vented and offered each other advice, and it was actually quite nice. But isn't the moment right before the beginning of the end always so sweet? Incel tells us what is bothering him, and lo and behold, it's a girl who refused his romantic advances. He said she had been leading him on and pretended to be his friend and wanting something more, but she had recently told him that she wasn't interested in him, and he was ugly and yada yada yada. I remember this did sound a bit off to me, but I had no reason to doubt this guy I considered my friend, so I gave him advice. I said to respect her wishes, though it might hurt, and that if she was not interested in him in the same way he was interested in her, and he was not comfortable with being just her friend, he should probably stop talking to her altogether and focus on building other friendships without the intent of something more down the line. We all ended our impromptu bonding session on what I thought were good terms, discussing how excited we were for playing again the next week. The DM even hinted that the story wasn't even 25% done. It was based on a questline from Elder Scrolls Online. This, of course, made me even more excited because I was so ready. But we only really played 4 sessions after this. I'm remembering all this by looking at my notes for each session and just my crappy memory, so it might not be a perfect recollection. The week after, we started session 10 with a bang. We had just unexpectedly kidnapped an NPC, Thandon, who worked for the baddies, and we were planning to interrogate him to gain intel. My character cast Zone of Truth, and Incel's character, Arden, began interrogating. However, I noticed his interrogation tactics consisted of torture that I won't go into here, but just know that it involved physical force. I reminded him in character that there was no need, since I casted, Zone of Truth, and he was magically compelled to tell the truth anyway. My character stepped in once it seemed like he wasn't going to stop, and just continued the interrogation. We progressed, and I compared Thandon's mistress with my character's own deity, Lorcan, and was actually having an awesome time as it seemed Thandon was receptive to my character's persuasiveness and coming around to Lorcan and our side overall. Maybe we could turn this bad guy into an ally and he could help us defeat his former mistress, not out of necessity, but because he wants to redeem himself and do some good in the world. The DM was hinting as much, and I was so excited for the possibilities of non-magically convincing a formerly bad NPC to join the side of good. And then Incel cut off Thandon's arm. I'm sorry, I did in fact write that. Incel cut off this NPC's whole arm right up to the shoulder. Honestly, I don't remember quite how Incel worded it, but he just rolled and then stated as a matter of fact since the NPC was restrained and he'd rolled high. My DM, although I could tell she was as shocked as me, went with it and described how Thandon was losing blood and fast. My character acted just as fast and casted Cure Wounds on the dude and tended to his severed arm. I, again, in character, went off on Incel. However, there was no other way to react to this that wouldn't derail the campaign besides just accepting it. The rest of the session was a blur, but once we ended, our DM spoke to Incel about his character's brash actions and reminded him that this game wasn't just a conduit for overt physically violent stories and that we all had to be comfortable with everyone else's actions at the table. He apologized for his brashness, but said no when she offered to retcon the, arm cutting. Honestly, I should have just quit right there. Session 11 comes around and we're sneaking through the sewers of a city. NPC Thandon has reluctantly agreed to help us, mostly because he'll be killed by his now former mistress if he goes back. But the DM did a bit of hinting that it was also because of my character's speech before it all, went to hell. Much of the session was a blur due to stress, and my notes confirm as much, but at some point, my character was berating Incel's character due to the poor choices that led to cutting this guy's arm off. So Incel's character, Arden, does what every rational, emotionally mature, literal adult does after an argument where they are proven to be incorrect. He cuts off his own arm. Yes, let me repeat that for emphasis. He cuts off his own arm. At this point, I'm wondering why I'm even trying, as my character casts Cure Wounds again and is suddenly dealing with two one-armed dudes that ended up as such because of one character's edginess and sheer stupidity. But don't worry guys, he did it to prove a point. After all,
It's not that hard to get by with one arm, and I'll prove it to you.
snip. Yeah, I basically mentally checked out at that point. I'm pretty sure the DM did the same and was just going through the motions. We played 2 more sessions after this, and they were an absolute blur, filled with need a hand jokes and existential dread. Oh, and he also tried to shoehorn a romance between our characters that I said I wasn't comfortable with, both in and out of character. But honestly, that's just a small crimson dot on the literal ocean of red flags this dude exuded. I told the DM I wasn't comfortable playing this campaign anymore after that, and she agreed and ended the campaign. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I did end up playing with him again, but I dipped out of the campaign after his literal 14-year-old character was all over my adult 20-year-old character, and he would not take no for an answer. I eventually stopped playing with the group altogether for different reasons, and this remains one of the most uncomfortable experiences I've ever been at in a D&D game. But maybe I'll tell you about the other stories some other time. For now, I hope you enjoyed and were as shocked and horrified as I was, because what else can you do to prove a point but cut off an appendage, logically? TLDR, Incel's character cuts off the arm of an NPC after being denied his torture porn fantasy. When called out on it, Incel's character cuts off his own arm to prove a point. Campaign kind of falls apart after that. We're not going to talk about the 14-year-old flirting in the final paragraph, because honestly, that's a rabbit hole and a can of worms I don't even want to open nor go down. I don't even know where to begin with that. Just know it's gross. It's utterly gross. But anyway, beyond that, I know, I'm gonna get a comment saying, "Oh my god, I cut off limbs in my D&D game and everyone loves it." That's great. That's not the kind of game that the OP and their DM was trying to run, clearly. So that guy should respect that. Every game is going to be different, especially since it's implied that that guy's actions in this little interrogation scene were much worse than just Jaime Lannistering an arm. This DM handled the situation fairly alright, taking that guy aside, talking to him about the situation, telling him it was not okay, and then offering to retcon. Not bad at all. That guy, however, refusing to allow that to happen, probably was a warning sign that he shouldn't stick around. Best of luck to the OP in finding a better game. And with that, we have arrived at the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our Campaign Diary podcast, where I talk about my D&D campaign, Descent into the Veil, and while you're there, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. Finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment his whole arm to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.